The cultural weight of sexual morality and sexual shame is so heavy that people often confuse this toxic shame with virtue. They mistake repression for goodness. But the truth is, toxic shame doesn't make you moral. It makes you split, fragmented. It splits you between the face you show others and the hidden, honest self that you keep in the dark. And that's where the damage begins, because the parts of you that are forced into exile don't just disappear.
Welcome to Beyond Success, the podcast for high achievers seeking deeper meaning, fulfillment, and purpose. Now, here's your host, world-renowned leadership coach and therapist, David Tian, PhD.
When most people hear the word morality, their first thought isn't justice or courage or compassion. It's sex. And that's strange, isn't it? Even in educated secular circles, morality still gets tangled up with sexual rules. What you should or shouldn't do, who you should or shouldn't sleep with, and how much of it is too much. It's a knee-jerk association, a holdover from traditional times. So if that's where your mind goes first, it's not your fault. You've inherited centuries of cultural or religious baggage. But here's the deeper problem. When morality gets reduced to sexual repression, it stops being about what's actually good for us. It becomes about avoiding shame instead of building character. It's like judging the quality of someone's entire life by how many slices of pizza they eat. It's absurd, but powerful enough that it shapes people's identities and relationships for decades. I've worked with clients who were brilliant in their careers, bold in business decisions, but crushed under the weight of sexual shame. They weren't murderers or thieves. They hadn't cheated anyone out of money, but they still carried the sense that they were somehow bad. And that quiet, corrosive shame held them back from trust, intimacy, and fulfillment. So in this episode, I want to reframe sexual morality, not as a set of permissions or prohibitions, but as a question. What does good actually mean here? If we define good not as rule following, but as what is genuinely good for us, what builds trust, honesty, and flourishing, how would that change the way we think about sex? This isn't about giving you a new list of do's and don'ts. It's about asking what sexual integrity looks like when it flows from compassion, courage, and honesty. Because if morality at its core is meant to guide us toward fulfillment, then sexual morality should be judged by the same standard. Does it help us live more authentically? Does it help us connect more deeply? Does it foster trust and flourishing? That's where I want to start today, by separating morality from shame, and then rebuilding it into the foundation of what actually leads to a meaningful and fulfilling life. I'm David Tian, a Brown University certified leadership and performance coach and a certified IFS therapy practitioner. And for almost the past 2 decades, I've been helping hundreds of thousands of people from over 87 countries find fulfillment, meaning, and success in their personal and professional lives. And before we go any further, I want to be clear about what this episode is and what it isn't. This is not a theological treatment of sexual morality. So if you're a devout follower of a religion like Christianity or Islam or any other tradition, you should consult your pastor, priest, imam, rabbi, or whatever religious authority. I say this with respect because I understand where you're coming from. In my 20s, I went to seminary. I was a missionary and an evangelist. I even won a prize in New Testament Koine Greek. I know that many religious worldviews are internally consistent on their own terms, even if they don't always track with what we learn and know from science. This podcast episode assumes the truth of evolution and draws from philosophy, psychology, and the lived realities of human relationships. So if your framework is a purely theological one, then this episode may not be for you. And for those who are not devout, let me clarify at the outset what we already know intellectually. Safe sex between consenting adults who are not committed to other partners is not morally wrong from a non-religious standpoint. Okay, let's just get that clear. The real question we're exploring here is what sexual morality looks like when we define good not by external rules, but by what is good for us, what fosters trust, compassion, integrity, fulfillment in life. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, I've got 5 points here, and here's the first. Sexual morality has always carried more weight than most other kinds of morality. Historically, religious codes like Christianity and Islam tied moral goodness directly to sexual purity. Whole systems of law and social standing were built on regulating sexual behavior. Who you could touch, who you could marry, who you could sleep with, and when. In the Victorian era, sexual restraint wasn't just a value, it was like a badge of respectability. Even now, in modern secular societies, echoes of this remain. Think about the cultural taboos that are still around. The scarlet letter, slut-shaming, double standards about men and women, the way a person's sexual history can still be used to judge their moral worth. It's almost as if we've carried these centuries-old and millennia-old equation of sexual control equals moral goodness, and we took that and carried it into our modern present without ever asking whether it still makes sense. And the result is shame. Toxic shame becomes the dominant experience when many people think about sex and morality. For many of my clients, the deepest moral guilt they carry isn't about lying on a tax return or being cruel in a workplace argument or even in betraying a friend. It's about and has to do with sex. And here's a blunt truth. Most people aren't weighed down by murder guilt or theft guilt, but sexual guilt, that's one they carry for decades of their lives. I've seen this with clients in their 30s who still feel dirty for what they did as teenagers. I've seen it with executives who could negotiate and do negotiate multi-million-dollar deals, but couldn't face their own partner with honesty about their actual, true, honest desires. In relationships, this shows up when someone lies about their needs or hides part of themselves because they fear being labeled immoral. In leadership, it shows up when someone performs a polished image in public but feels like a fraud in private. The cultural weight of sexual morality and sexual shame is so heavy that people often confuse this toxic shame with virtue. They mistake repression for goodness. But the truth is, toxic shame doesn't make you moral. It makes you split, fragmented. It splits you between the face you show others and the hidden, honest self that you keep in the dark. And that's where the damage begins, because the parts of you that are forced into exile don't just disappear. They come out through the shadows, come out sideways, often in compulsions or betrayals or self-sabotage or double lives. So when we ask, why does morality get tied up with sex so much more than with other aspects of life? The answer is history. Centuries and millennia of religious codes and cultural taboos have left us with a distorted inheritance. These are legacy burdens. And unless we challenge them, we'll keep carrying this toxic sexual shame like a hidden burden, even when we've rejected every other form of moral rule-keeping. This is why the first step in rethinking sexual morality is to notice how much of the weight we feel isn't natural, it's inherited. And if we want to live in integrity, if we want congruence between our inner and outer lives, we can't keep dragging around this borrowed burden of shame. We have to ask what actually is good for us, what fosters actually trust, compassion, and fulfillment. Because morality that begins in toxic shame will always end in despair and fragmentation. Morality that begins in compassion has the chance to lead us to flourishing. So the second point is, and this one requires us to look deeper into where sexual norms even came from, and this is the evolutionary perspective. From an evolutionary perspective, the rules around sex weren't random. So earlier we went into history, and we're now going to go into even deeper history. These rules emerged to serve group survival and later elite power. Regulating paternity meant that men knew which children were theirs, so that they would be more likely to invest their resources in raising these children. Rules around marriage, fidelity, reproduction stabilized child-rearing and protected alliances. These sexual norms weren't always about love or fairness. They were strategies, adaptive ways for a community to manage resources and maintain order. But here's where it gets messier. Those adaptive strategies hardened into rigid codes that often outlived their usefulness, and people forgot why they had them in the first place. But they kept them there and working and trying to adhere to them. So what worked for small tribes thousands of years ago doesn't map neatly now onto modern life. But the rules stuck, carried forward by religions and social customs. So what began as survival tactics turned into absolute prohibitions. And those prohibitions fueled generations of shame and repression. And we can't ignore the later role of power. So, through much of recorded history, who do you see setting the rules? Elites, noblemen, kings, emperors, rulers, men who had multiple wives, concubines, mistresses. King Solomon, to whom Jesus Christ traces his ancestry on his mother's side, had, according to the Bible, 300 wives and 700 concubines. Meanwhile, the vast majority of men had to compete for whatever sexual opportunities were left over from the elites. Biologists estimate that for much of human history, only a small fraction of men, sometimes as few as 1 for every 17 women, actually passed on their genes. The sex ratio at birth has always been roughly 1-to-1, but sexual opportunity has never been equal. So how do you keep the common man in check? You control him with sexual mores. Religious rules, traditional taboos around sex, these were a way to keep lower-class men virtuous, which really meant compliant, easily controlled. No adultery, no promiscuity, no sex outside marriage, no alternatives to the official structure of marriage that is controlled by the elite. Meanwhile, the elites exempted themselves. Their status gave them cover to indulge while preaching restraint to everyone else. And that history still haunts us. The result today is that unnecessary toxic shame, secrecy, and duplicity get baked into how people approach sex. A man may feel shame for desires that are perfectly normal and healthy. A woman may internalize stigma for behavior that harms no one. Couples hide, lie, or self-censor, not out of compassion or integrity, but out of fear of toxic judgment. So, when morality gets equated with repression, we confuse virtue with denial. But real virtue is about cultivating qualities that let us flourish, like integrity, courage, compassion. Repression does the opposite. It splits us, fractures us. It makes us act one way in public and another in private. It pushes us into secrecy, hypocrisy, and ultimately, mistrust. So if you've ever felt weighed down by sexual shame, understand this. It is not a sign that you've failed morally. It's a sign that you've inherited a cultural script written for someone else's survival and someone else's power. The real work is to ask yourself, what does goodness mean now in your own life? How do we rebuild sexual morality on principles that actually foster trust, authenticity, fulfillment, instead of repression and control? And that's the transition to the next point. If morality isn't repression, then what is it? What does a virtue-based, flourishing-centered approach to sex actually look like? Okay, that's the next point. So this is now moving to the third point. And this is where we pivot from history and biology now into philosophy and critical thinking. Aristotle and Confucius both saw morality not as rule-keeping, but as character-building. The goal wasn't to memorize commands and avoid infractions, but instead to cultivate the kind of person who naturally acts in ways that foster harmony and flourishing. For Aristotle, virtue was a habit of choosing the mean between extremes, like courage, which lies between cowardice and recklessness. For Confucius, the guise, the nobleman, the noble person, becomes someone whose actions flow with integrity, not because he's forcing himself to obey, but because he's trained his character until the right choice comes naturally. Applied to sexuality, the question shifts from which acts are forbidden to what kind of person am I becoming through my choices? Okay, this is a very different frame. A checklist of forbidden behaviors only tells you what not to do. But asking about character asks, instead, am I cultivating honesty, compassion, and courage, or am I reinforcing deceit, selfishness, cowardice? C.S. Lewis once observed that integrity is not tested in the big public acts, but in the quiet private ones. In sexuality, this is doubly true. If your sexual relationships are marked by deception, manipulation, or cowardice, like stringing someone along because you're afraid to be alone, or saying what they want to hear so you can keep access to sex, then you're not just hurting them, you're actually shaping yourself. You're training your own character toward duplicity. And the consequences aren't just guilt, it's fragmentation, it's splitting. You become someone you can't fully trust because you know the truth about how you operate when the stakes are high. But when sexual choices are marked by honesty, respect, care, then they reinforce your integrity. Integrity here does not mean prudishness. It means congruence. It means your actions align with your values, and your treatment of others reflects compassion rather than exploitation. That's why some casual relationships, when handled with openness and respect, can be healthier than long-term ones built on lies or coercion. I've seen this play out in dating lives as well as in professional leadership. A client of mine used to juggle multiple partners while assuring each one of them that she was the only one. He was doing this before working with me, of course. He thought he was being clever, protecting himself from loneliness. But when one woman uncovered the truth, the fallout wasn't just in his love life, it spilled into his work. He second-guessed himself in board meetings, anxious that colleagues might see him as two-faced, which he was, because deep down he knew he was. The duplicity in one area corroded his confidence in all areas. Contrast that with another client, an executive who went through a divorce, and he committed to honesty, even or especially when it was uncomfortable. He told new partners the truth about his fears, his boundaries, his uncertainties. And he discovered that his integrity in his personal life strengthened his leadership presence. He didn't need to rely on faking it or BS or spin. People trusted him because he trusted himself. And that's the heart of virtue ethics. Morality is not about whether you technically broke a rule. It's about the kind of person you are becoming through your repeated choices. And when it comes to sex, the stakes are high because sex brings intimacy, vulnerability, and power all into play. You can use those moments to cultivate honesty and compassion, or you can use them to hide, manipulate, or exploit. Either way, you're training your soul. You are determining who you will become. Now, keep in mind, this isn't about perfection. Both Aristotle and Confucius knew that virtue is cultivated gradually over time, like strengthening a muscle. You make choices every day, and those choices shape your character over time. Of course, setbacks or slip-ups are inevitable, but what matters most is the direction of your cultivation. Are you moving towards harmony, congruence, and compassion? Or are you moving toward fragmentation, shame, and distrust? The mistake of traditional sexual morality was to reduce all of this to external rules. Don't do this, don't do that. But true sexual morality, the kind that leads to life fulfillment, asks the harder question. Who are you becoming through how you love, how you touch, how you connect, how you do intimacy? And that's where the work lies, because every choice in this realm is not just about pleasure or taboo. It's about character. And character, over time, is what makes the difference between a life that's fractured and anxious and a life that's integrated and fulfilling. Sometimes success comes with a hidden cost. You might have built a career, a business, or a life you thought you wanted, but inside, maybe you feel burned out or unfulfilled. Or maybe it shows up in your relationships with your partner, your family, or your team, where no matter how hard you try, the same painful patterns keep repeating. If this resonates, I've got something you might be interested in. It's a free 2-minute assessment that helps you uncover the #1 block that's been holding you back in love, in leadership, or in life. And once you take it, you'll get a masterclass tailored specifically to your results, so you'll know exactly where to focus to move forward. It's quick, it's practical, and it can change the way you see yourself and your path ahead. Take the first step right now at dtphd.com/quiz. That's dtphd.com/quiz. Now let's turn to the problem of toxic shame, because this is where so much of the pain around sexual morality gets lodged. One of Carl Jung's hallmark concepts is the shadow. Those parts of ourselves that we repress or deny because they don't fit the image that we want to present to others or to ourselves. In sexuality, the shadow often takes the form of desires that we judge as wrong, or memories that we'd rather bury because they're sinful or wrong. But the shadow doesn't disappear just because we push it down or exile it. It returns as compulsions, addictions, secrecy, self-sabotage. It seeps out in the very ways that we least want. Internal Family Systems Therapy, or IFS, gives us another lens on this. Shame doesn't just hover in the air, it buries parts of us. The vulnerable sexual parts of ourselves get exiled, locked away in inner dungeons, because we decide, often when we're very young, that those parts are too dangerous or too shameful to show. And once those parts are exiled, our protector parts take over. And our protector parts come in with intensity, sometimes by numbing us with porn or fantasy, sometimes by pushing us toward reckless hookups, sometimes by avoiding intimacy altogether. All in an effort to keep the exiles in us hidden and to keep us from feeling that toxic shame again. It's crucial here to distinguish between guilt and shame. Guilt, or healthy guilt, is a signal. It says you crossed a line, you hurt someone, you went against your values, you betrayed your conscience or your principles. So guilt can guide us back to integrity. But shame is toxic. So sometimes I'll just say toxic shame, just so there's no confusion. Shame doesn't say, that was a bad choice. Shame says, you are bad. And when your core sense of self gets infected with that poison of that message of shame, it infects and poisons everything. This is why shame is so corrosive to relationships. It fractures the self. It forces you to hide parts of who you are. It grounds the relationship on deception. And if you can't accept yourself fully, then you can't let someone else truly know who you are either. Shame creates walls where intimacy needs openness. Shame turns sex from an expression of connection into a stage for performance and secrecy or avoidance. I've had clients who looked perfect on the outside, like successful careers, relationships that seemed stable, so on, but who were collapsing inside under the weight of sexual shame. One man confessed to me that every time he had sex, he felt a low-level disgust, not because his partner had done anything wrong, but because deep down, he'd learned to equate sexual pleasure with sin. You could never relax, never fully connect. Another client couldn't stop sabotaging his relationships because he was terrified his partner would discover his history with porn or casual hookups. And that terror of being found out kept him from trusting anyone, even people who genuinely cared for him. So shame doesn't make us better. It doesn't make us more virtuous. It hurts us. It makes us fragmented. It keeps us shut down. It keeps us split. It keeps us at war with ourselves. And when you're at war with yourself, no relationship, romantic, professional, or even spiritual, will ever feel secure. Because intimacy requires trust, and trust starts with the ability to face yourself honestly. So if you've been struggling with sexual shame, the invitation is not to repress harder or to pretend you're pure. It's to confront the shadow, to recognize that shame is not proof that you're evil. It's proof that you've exiled a part or parts of yourself. And until those parts are brought back with compassion, they will keep haunting you. The real work of sexual morality is not about enforcing shame. It's about cultivating integration. It's about bringing your exiled parts back into dialogue with the rest of you, so you can act with honesty, courage, and compassion, not out of fear or secrecy. And that's the path toward true intimacy, true trust, and true fulfillment. So now let's move to the fifth and final point. If shame fractures us, then reframing morality means that we need a new standard, one that doesn't rely on repression or borrowed rules, but on whether our choices line up with the virtues that actually make life worth living. So here's the healthier frame. Sexual morality is best judged by whether it's consistent with integrity, compassion, and courage. Let's zoom in on integrity first. That's honesty with yourself and with your partner. It's saying what you really mean, not what you think the other person just wants to hear just to keep them around. Without integrity, every relationship becomes unstable because there's always a hidden layer. And you feel it inside. You know when you're not being straight. Over time, that eats away at your self-trust. If you lie to a partner, you also train yourself to doubt your own word. Compassion next. This is about valuing someone intrinsically, not instrumentally, not just for what they can do for you. When compassion guides your choices, you don't see the other person as a means to your end, as a body or a prop for your own validation. You see them instead as a human being with their own needs, longings, and vulnerabilities. Compassion says, I want you to have a good experience too. I want to do no harm to you. I don't want my short-term gain to undermine your long-term well-being. That doesn't mean you have to stay in every relationship forever. It means that even in a casual connection, even a one-night stand, you treat the other person with dignity and respect. And finally, courage. Sexual morality requires the courage to own your own desires and fears openly. It's not easy to admit what you really want sometimes, especially when you fear rejection. It's not easy to say no when pressure's there. Courage means choosing honesty, even or especially when it's uncomfortable, even or especially when it risks loss. Ironically, that's what builds the foundation for real intimacy and trust, because intimacy requires truth, and truth requires courage. So let's ground this in real life. I once worked with a man who prided himself on being smooth with women. He always had someone new, and he never lacked for dates. But his strategy was deception. He would tell women he wanted a relationship when he actually didn't. He would dangle the promise of exclusivity in front of them while actually seeing plenty of other women on the side. And for a while, it worked for him. But over time, the cost piled up, and he felt constantly anxious, and increasingly so, terrified of being caught, exhausted from having to keep track of all the lies. And his dating life was so busy that it affected his professional life, and the whole time his heart was hollow. That's what happens when sex is built on manipulation and deception. It corrodes both trust and fulfillment in you. Contrast that with another client who was honest about wanting something casual. He told partners right up front, the first time they met, I like spending time with you, but I'm not looking for anything long-term right now. Some walked away, but the ones who were meant for him stayed, and they respected him more. And those connections, though casual and temporary at the time, were also more meaningful because they didn't go against his conscience and his values, and he could sleep easy at night without guilt, and his self-respect and self-trust grew over time. So did his courage. The same principles apply outside dating. In leadership, integrity, compassion, and courage are the virtues that inspire trust. Leaders who manipulate or hide create cultures of fear and suspicion. Leaders who act with honesty and care, even or especially when delivering bad news, build teams that are loyal and resilient. So sexual morality isn't just a separate category of life. It's the same virtues applied just to one of the most intimate arenas we live in. And because sex touches our vulnerability so directly, the stakes here are even higher. If you practice integrity, compassion, and courage here, you strengthen them everywhere in your life. If you compromise them here, you will weaken them everywhere in your life. So if you want to live out this new frame of sexual morality, here is where it starts. Practice. Not just in theory, definitely not rules, but daily practice. The first practice I would suggest is compassionate honesty. That means being clear about your own desires and boundaries without slipping into manipulation or avoidance. If you want something casual, just say so, up front. If you're looking for commitment, admit it. Integrity here does not mean being brutal or cold. It means being direct, but with compassion. You hold your truth while still caring for how the other person receives it. That balance builds trust and respect, even if your paths end up diverging. The second practice is courage in difficult conversations. I first heard this from Tim Ferriss, and it's been highly influential in my life. The quality of your life is a direct reflection of your willingness to have difficult conversations. Here, conversations about sex, boundaries, or unmet needs can feel terrifying. But avoidance only guarantees confusion and resentment. Courage is naming the discomfort. It's saying, this is what I want, or this is what scares me, even when your voice shakes. Paradoxically, those moments of fear are also the doorway to intimacy. If you can reveal yourself honestly, you make space for your partner to do the same. And this courageous invitation is one of the most attractive things you can do. A third practice is what I call philosophical hashing it out. Take the time to wrestle with your own views about sex and morality. You can do this alone through journaling or in dialogue with a trusted professional or coach or in a supportive group. The point is to surface the assumptions that you've inherited, whether they are religious or cultural or family-based, and hold them up against the evidence in the light of reason and the question of what truly leads to integrity, compassion, and courage in your life. You'll be surprised at how many of these rules crumble when you examine them in the light of reason. The fourth practice I'd recommend is reflection on where shame shows up. So you can keep a journal and you can ask yourself, where did I feel shame today? Was it tied to something I actually did wrong? Something that violated my thought-through values? Or was it leftover cultural baggage and legacy burdens? The more you can distinguish healthy guilt from toxic shame, the more clarity you will gain in your life. And with clarity comes freedom. Finally, normalize the struggle. Everyone wrestles with this. Every one of us has made choices that we regret. Morality is not about perfection. It's about cultivation. Every time you choose honesty over deception, compassion over selfishness, courage over cowardice, you are strengthening those muscles. And over time, that's what shapes a life of integration and fulfillment. So if you're listening and feeling weighed down, here's the good news. You don't need to carry shame as your teacher anymore. The work is to practice these virtues in small, consistent ways. Day by day, those practices will form the kind of person you can trust, the kind of person others can trust, and the kind of person who can live with both freedom and peace. Sexual morality is not about prudish rules or outdated codes. It's about whether our choices line up with the virtues that actually help us flourish, like integrity, compassion, courage. When we treat morality as repression, it fractures us and fills us with shame. But when we treat morality as character cultivation, it gives us inner harmony, self-trust, and trust from others. And if you struggled here, you're not broken. You're not evil. You're human. Every single one of us has stumbled in some way. Every single one of us has carried shame. The point is not perfection. It's direction. Each step you take toward honesty. Each choice you make to face fear with courage. Each moment you treat another person with compassion. That's how you build a character you can live with, a character you can trust. So if you've been carrying that hidden weight, let this be your reminder. You don't need to keep dragging it along. Sexual morality, reframed, is not about shame. It's about cultivating the virtues that make life more fulfilling, that let you rest easy in your own skin, and that allow your relationships to be grounded in trust rather than fear. In the next episode, we'll dig into the shadow side of morality, because the truth is, everyone has unvirtuous parts. Everyone. And pretending otherwise only makes things a lot worse. The real work is integration, bringing those parts of us into the light, understanding them, and finding a way to live with integrity without cutting off parts of who you are. Thank you so much for listening. If this has helped you in any way, please share it with anyone else you think could benefit from it. If you liked it, hit a like or give it a good rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you have any feedback whatsoever, I'd love to get it. Leave a comment, send me a message. I'd love to get your feedback. Again, thank you so much for listening. I look forward to welcoming you to the next episode. Until then, David Tian, signing out.